So this is part 2 of our Phylum Echinodermata. You should have your note packet in front of you so you can follow along and fill in information that you think is valuable. We're starting with the first class, class Asteroidea. This is these are the typical echinoderms that most people think of. These are the starfish. But to be correct, they're actually called sea stars because they're not actually fish. So you should try to use that terminology when you're talking about this particular type of echinoderm. Typically they have about 5 arms around their central disc, and the central disc is just that center area on them. They live on rocks, crawl around the sea bottom. There's about 1,500 species of these guys. Talking about their skeletal system, it's pretty similar to what we talked about before. They have the endoskeleton. They have rows of ossicles running underneath the length of each arm, and you'll be able to see these when we do the dissection. And they create this area called an ambulacral groove. And this groove consists of 2 rows of tube feet, and then there's the radial canal and radial nerve that's inside of those ambulacral grooves. When they eat, sea stars are either scavengers or they're predators. They actually hunt. They feed on snails, bivalves, polychaetes, coral, and detritus. Detritus is just organic crud that falls to the seafloor. Most of these guys will feed on bivalves, or clams, oysters. And they do this by wrapping their arms around them and applying pressure. And they use different arms until they get tired, and then they alternate. And then they do this until that bivalve gets weakened. When the bivalve shell is about 0.1 millimeter apart, that's a very small amount, the starfish can evert or push out its cardiac stomach into the shell, releases some enzymes, it starts to break down the bivalve, and then it weakens even more, and then the sea star can open and finish eating. Now, just think about the clams that we were trying to get open in lab. And even though they were dead, they still have that amount of pressure when they're alive, staying closed. So you can only imagine how strong these sea stars have to be to try and pry open a clam or an oyster. It's a lot of strength in those little guys. So their stomach is actually very large. It takes up a lot of their coelom space. They kind of have 2 parts to their stomach. They have a cardiac stomach, and then they have a pyloric stomach. Cardiac stomach is bigger, and that's what gets the food first. And then the pyloric stomach helps to break it down more and spread the nutrients around. And you'll be identifying both in our dissection. And here's just a diagram of a sea star folded around one of those bivalves, trying to pry it open. As far as gas exchange, they have something called dermal branchiae. They're kind of extensions in the body wall that help them through diffusion exchange gases. They can get rid of metabolic wastes this way as well. The tube feet membranes are pretty thin, so they can exchange gases through their tube feet. And their main nitrogenous waste is ammonia. And if you remember way back, this form of nitrogenous waste is the most toxic and it's the most concentrated, but it's okay because these guys live in water, so it's diluted as soon as they release it. As far as a nervous system, they don't have a brain, but they do have a nerve ring around their mouth, and then there's nerves that extend down into their arms, and it helps them move. They have sense receptors located all over that help detect all kinds of things in their environment, the changes in light, temperature, chemicals. And then on the ends of their tube feet, they have something called ocelli. And these are light sensitive cells, so they're not eyes that can see stuff. They're just eyes that can see light, basically. As far as reproduction goes, you could say in a way that sea stars have asexual reproduction, because if part of them, if one of their arms along with the central disc is removed, they can regrow an entire new sea star as long as part of that central disc is there. And this is good actually, because what I have here on the slide is called autotomy. If a predator has them by one of their arms, they can actually self-amputate. They kind of let go of that arm, and that way they can get away from that predator and regrow their damaged limb. But their true reproduction is sexual fertilization. They are dioecious, and they will have external fertilization if it's an appropriate place. And it's safe enough for those larvae. Their embryos are ciliated and they eat plankton. They become this other type of larva called a bipinnaria. I'm not going to ask you to remember that, but when the arms start to grow and they settle to the ocean floor, they become a brachiolaria larva, and that will eventually develop into the adult starfish. After this, in your note sheet, you can see sea stars written, or sea daisies rather. We're going to go through and label sea stars first, and then you'll come back to the sea daisies. And there's very little information on them, but you might want to add a couple of the little notes there. So you will be labeling this diagram in your note packet. You can pause the video so you can label, but you will be identifying all these parts when we do our dissection. The major porite is the sieve plate. The anus is just kind of a small opening. It doesn't really show it very easily here. And this is the underside. So the image you saw before, I want you to label that as the aboral, A-B-O-R-A-L, and this is the oral side of the starfish or sea star. It's important that you know the difference between the two, because in the dissection they're going to have you laying it in a certain way, and plus I ask you questions, where's the anus located, oral or aboral side, and you'll have to know that. But you can pause the video here so you can finish labeling your diagram. Here's just an image of the pedicellaria on the surface of their skin. This gives you a little more idea about the water vascular system inside of them. It shows you their stomachs. It shows you the ambulacral ridge. You'll be finding all of these, and they're actually pretty easy to see in these sea stars. You'll find their gonads. You'll be able to find their pyloric ceca. And like I said, it's pretty well defined. It's not like the mushiness of some of the others that we've seen. They're pretty easy to distinguish in the sea stars. This is another cross section of one of their arms, so you can see what the structures would look like from the side. Here's just an up close of the major porite. It's just like a lighter tan circular area on them. And then here's the water vascular system of the sea star. So you can pause the video and label your diagram. Here we have the sea daisies that I mentioned before. They were classified differently, and now they're put back into class Asteroidea with the sea stars. They're very unique in this class. They don't have an internal digestive system, but they have this membrane called a velum that they help use to cover their food and absorb nutrients from their prey. They are rather small, and I think they had classified them in one of the more primitive classes of echinoderms, but they must have enough similarities to sea stars that they've placed them back into here. This is the last slide in this particular set of notes, so you can take another break or you can move on to the next part.